everybody. My guest on the show today is Mark Atkeson. Mark, he's an international business leader. I'm going to talk a lot more about what that means. He's an investor, he is an entrepreneur, and he is an author. Mark, thank you so much for being here. We just got a chance to catch up a little bit on your background, as this is our first time meeting, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you because, and I'll say this, people go, why do you podcast? And I'll say, a variety of reasons, but one of the things is I get to learn a lot. And I'm going to learn a lot today because we're going to talk about a topic that I am not an expert in. So Mark, welcome. So good to have you here.
Yeah, Jason, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to share with everyone my career in China.
Career in China. Yes, which is, I've never been to China. So as I said, I buy a lot of things from China. I know I do a lot of business from China, transactionally. So Mark, let's kick off here before we dig into your expertise. What do you want us to know about you, or what would you like to share about you and your life?
Yeah, so I wrote this book, Risky Business in Rising China, which basically describes my career in China over 30 years. And, coming out of that, Jason, I learned a lot of lessons about taking risks, about reinventing myself, about making opportunities. As you can imagine, the Chinese economy from 1980 until very recently was just growing great guns, huge modernization. They went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being relatively high income by any standard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for people to understand and engage. China's here to stay. When you think about things like solar cells, batteries, TikTok, there's all kinds of stuff. China's going to be around for the rest of the foreseeable future, and so we need to figure out how to engage with them.
Yeah, and this is something you spent 30 years doing. You now help other companies do this as well. I'm curious, if we kick off here, what are some things that potentially, I'm going to speak mostly to the American audience here, but I would assert, I know I have people that listen to the EU and Canada and such, that maybe there's some misnomers or some things that aren't fully understood, because my extent of understanding China and the economics and all those things is pretty much what I see or read in the news. And that's it. And I know that a lot of the things I see or read in the news are influenced by by what's going on in politics, or by politicians themselves who are saying things because it suits their agenda for what they're working on. So I'd love if we could spend a few minutes on things that you've learned, that like an average person like me is not necessarily going to understand.
Yeah, no, great question. And I would say that probably the most common misconception about China is that China is this big monolithic state-owned economy controlled by a central government. They're out there, they're working on cornering markets, they're working on manipulating things, they're working on all kinds of things that we give them too much credit for, and we're probably a little bit paranoid about. And here's the way to really think about China. And this is something that I learned over my career there, which is that 60% of the GDP of China is actually the private sector, and 80% of all the jobs basically come from the private sector. And what is the private sector? It's millions of firms that are adaptable, very flexible, very fast moving, jumping on market opportunities, and they're run by Chinese entrepreneurs who, for the most part, are basically free agents. And when I say free agents, meaning that these are people who are self-made, who basically are not in it for the country, they're in it for themselves, just as you would expect any businessman in the United States. So, as a business person in America trying to do deals in China, working with Chinese entrepreneurs is very straightforward. You can partner with them very creatively. You can work with them to source things as well as sell things. So I think it's important for people to recognize that China is a much more complex and diverse economy than what we normally see in the U.S. media.
Yeah, and you covered a lot of the things that maybe I have a specific way of looking at it, just from what I've consumed over the years, and being the age I am too, where there was a time where that could be one of our biggest enemies in the future, and still sometimes see that rhetoric. But one of the things you mentioned that it really struck me is the straightforward way of doing business. Like, I'd love to hear more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so in my career, I started out with working with big state-owned companies like Air China, the flag carrier of the country. I then
Mm-hmm.
worked with a engine company that was owned by the state, making MiG aircraft engines, and we ended up
Mm.
creating a joint venture with them to make parts for the U.S. aerospace market. And then I ended up in a company that had gone from state-owned to semi-private under, with private equity investors. And unfortunately, that state-owned culture had come through, and these guys were just highly corrupt. I spent
Yeah.
basically 2 years turning around a diesel engine parts business where the salespeople were taking kickbacks, the procurement people were taking bribes, and the head of the factory was basically driving trucks into the factory and stealing parts out of the factory. So I got through that, and then I made I made a leap into the private sector, which was two other guys and I got together and we created an investment company in investing in small startup businesses in the mobile tech sector. So we were investing in Chinese entrepreneurial teams who in most cases at that time were importing technologies from the West, and they were importing successful business models and then adapting them for the China market. And what I found was that for the most part the Chinese were very upfront about what they were looking for in terms of the product that they wanted to integrate into the Chinese market. In terms of business deals in China, one of the interesting distinctions. So you mentioned, how Chinese can sometimes be more direct than we give them credit for. In
Mm-hmm.
America, we put a lot of emphasis into designing contracts and having terms and contracts sort of referee
Yeah.
outcomes in business transactions. And in China, they sort of push the contracts to the side. The more important thing was, did you truly have leverage? Did you have the money in your
Mm.
bank account, or did you have control of the product in your warehouse? And that was, the important thing in the business relationship. I would say that I got into a business where I was working together with Chinese entrepreneurs in the internet. So we were doing everything from payment systems to entertainment and gaming and all that stuff. And they were let me say this, they were very focused on grabbing the commercial opportunity in the markets as fast as they could. And this is, another distinction that you sometimes hear about China is that the Chinese are very good at commercializing product and services into their market. And they have to act quickly. And part of the reason they have to act quickly is because as soon as anybody starts making money, hundreds of other private sector companies jump in. And so the
Yeah.
marginal return is
Mm.
driven down. So, I'm sure that,
Yeah.
the Chinese are also eyeing, what is successful in our markets and how do they go after that? Here's another good one, Jason. So look at
Yeah.
the electric vehicle companies in China. They're all
Yeah.
private. They're
Yeah.
all
Totally.
none of them are state owned. So
Yeah.
BYD was a phone battery company that got into cars. Xpeng, Li, all these guys, they're all private and they're all startup, and none of them existed just a few years ago. So
Yeah.
the Chinese are very fast to capitalize on market opportunities.
Mm. It's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about some of the like the intellectual property things that happen with certain companies like Hawaii, I think it's Huawei and DJI, the drone company, and now I think it's well known that the Chinese government blocks a lot of the like social media services. They build their own things, kind of like what Russia does as well. I want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and get your perspective on that. And then I think there's been some in the past, at least, there's been some talk about like Foxconn is building so much of things for Apple. Like what are the potential risks? And then of course, and you mentioned it, right now we're recording this in March of 2024. Right now, what's in the news that's big is what you mentioned, ByteDance, which owns TikTok, I think it's either gone to the Senate or it's about to go to the Senate with a potential, like, either you sell it or you don't do business here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said former Secretary Manchin is putting together his investment group to potentially buy it, I believe is the latest news. But just curious to get your overall, feelings about those things. Are they warranted? Is there a reason to feel that way? Is it demonizing? And anything that you want to share about that?
Yeah. So no, very good question. So I think that, look, in the early days, 30 years ago and even 20 years ago when I was in China, one of the biggest victims of intellectual property theft would have been Microsoft. So that the cash that they got back on users of Windows was probably 10% of the total, user population. So, huge amount of piracy, particularly in the sort of older fashioned operating systems and software that we're all familiar with. Fast forward to much more recent. So if you look at semiconductors today, I mean, it's really not a case of can you copy it? You do need to have certain manufacturing technology, as you need to have the ability to make incredibly tiny transistors that the Chinese don't have today, and of course the U.S. is trying to restrict them in that. If they could get access to that, they could probably start upgrading their semiconductors. But again, it's not simply a case of copying. And another good example is so Boeing and Airbus are obviously eyeing China, and at what point will China try to create aircraft and engines that can compete directly? If you look at aerospace technology, and particularly on the engine side, with what GE makes, there's so much material science inside of that engine that have taken 70 years to develop that the Chinese are not easily going to just be copying that. But let's be clear that the Chinese tend to focus more on, let's say, incremental innovations with short-term market opportunities. We in America, we're the alpha guys. We're very good at breakthrough technologies. We're not so good taking it to beta level and commercializing it. We eventually do, and obviously Apple is a great example of a company that has done an amazing job. And look, even today, Apple has iPhones which are copied by Xiaomi in China. Xiaomi is probably one of Apple's biggest competitors other than Huawei. But, Apple still is a strong company in China. The threat to Apple in China is not so much their product with its functions and features. It's the fact that the Chinese government is basically telling certain parts of the economy not to buy the Apple iPhone.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a political problem, not an intellectual property problem. So, Apple has done really well in China, even at the pricing, which tends to be more expensive than what the local products are. Talking quickly about TikTok. So I have to admit, I am a TikTok user. I find it very funny and very entertaining most of the time. I also find, Jason, I actually do find that it's a very useful form of newsfeed because
totally.
If you're scrolling through TikTok, you're immediately alerted to breaking news.
Absolutely.
And you're immediately alerted to things that, you feel are important. Now, I read an article I think The Economist came out with an article in its most recent edition about, they take the position that we should be restrictive of TikTok for the following reason, which is that countries tend to be sensitive to foreign ownership of traditional media. So, newspapers, magazines, television.
It's always been that way in the US. Yeah.
It's always been that way, and it's always been that way in most other countries. And so the concern is that if TikTok really is a form of newsfeed, then to what degree can the Chinese government, put bias into there to influence, consumers' opinions? So, that's an interesting point. I'll mention to you that in China, all of the U.S. social media is blocked. So no YouTube, no Facebook, no LinkedIn, no Google. And the Chinese might respond and say, well, all these companies failed to compete, and so they basically left the market. But
Mm.
I think it's deeper than that. So, if you ask me what should happen to TikTok, I'd be sad if it went away. It would be great if they could maybe spin it off and list it as an independently, a listed company on the US stock market or Hong Kong
Yeah.
or some other market. But who knows? So, complicated issues.
Complicated issues. Thanks, Mark. Before we get into kind of like what you're up to now with writing the book, and then also I know you have a real passion for the next generation of people coming into the workforce that want to do similar work. I'm curious, how did you like what was your path to become an expert on doing business in China? Like was that and I always wonder about this when I meet people like was this something that you're going to school and you're undergrad and your graduate degree and you go I'm going to do business in China. Sometimes you talk to people and it was purely random. They had a friend who went and did something and said, "Hey, can you help me with this?" So curious what like led you to become an expert and have all this knowledge and do all this business in China.
Yeah. So the short answer is I sort of stumbled into it, and it
Yep.
built momentum on its own.
Yeah.
The long the longer answer is I was an electrical engineering major in college,
Hmm.
and I took a trip with my family my freshman year, 1982, to Beijing. And at that time, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. And
Mm.
think about this, Jason. You have these stoic Chinese in threadbare Mao suits riding very simple black bicycles,
Yeah.
and only two-story buildings in Beijing. There's no neon, there are no cars, and you fast forward to today, and people are wearing designer suits. They're driving
Yeah.
BMWs, and so in my career in China, the kickoff was that I graduated from college and my engineering classmates went to AT&T,
Hmm.
and I had no desire to do that. And I also had this youthful, I guess, wanderlust that here I was, no commitments, early 20s, why not take a leap into China? The Western media was talking about, Coca-Cola, Procter and Gamble, Boeing, all these companies were trying to get into the country. So, there was certainly a buzz around that said, opportunity was developing in China. Um, and my first job was I took it with a machine tool company out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I mean, meat and
Mm-hmm.
potatoes, metal cutting, metal bashing. And the reason I joined those guys is because they were willing to send me straight into China, to work in industry in China.
Yeah.
And that was what I was looking for. I was looking for basically
That's cool.
exposure. And then it built on, from that, and I jumped. The beauty of what happened in China was that, as you can imagine, this amazing modernization, sectors would come up, new sectors would develop. So I moved from basically aircraft maintenance to automotive parts to mobile technology to venture capital to, aviation asset trading. So the key was just to keep moving forward and keep reinventing myself.
Mm. What did you learn to speak Chinese in college? Is that something
Good
that
question.
yeah.
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 So while I was doing engineering, I took 2 years of Chinese in college,
Yeah.
and when I got to China, I would say my Chinese was pretty rudimentary. It was pretty
Mm.
basic. But
Yeah.
in the 1980s, the economic life of the country was really slow. I mean, people were still basically riding bicycles and haggling with street vendors, and so there was a lot of time. Remember, no cell phones.
Yeah. No
You
internet.
would get
Yeah.
no internet. You jump on a train to go anywhere, so you had a lot of time to interact with the people, and that allowed me over time to really get my Chinese up to speed. And then, the other thing over the course of my career, particularly in the first half, Jason, I spent a lot of time in factories where I was the only foreigner in the factory, and
Mm.
so nobody in the factory spoke English. And in factory environments, you really have to get your point across. You have to
Yeah.
be well understood. so it worked out. And then in the second half of my career, I tended to be the older guy in the room, and I was dealing with millennials and Gen Z, much more in the internet world and in new technology. So there's one of the chapters is I worked with guys to develop electric vehicles, affordable electric vehicles for the U.S. market,
Mm.
and we had a team of about 70 Chinese engineers all of whom were probably 15 years younger than me. But all up and coming people in everything from battery technology to car manufacturing.
Hmm. So interesting. I had a question about venture capital / investing in China.
Yeah.
Just speaking for myself and my wife, I know we have like some international, like some international ETFs or some sort of mutual funds that do have like an Asian component. I believe obviously China is going to likely be in there. I'm curious about the investing environment there. And I guess as somebody who's never done any direct investing, is the government, I guess my question is, does the government get more involved? Like if you're going to go in there and put venture to a company or you want to do some investment, is there, like my perspective would be, and this is just my own like my own way of looking at it, which may be false, is that there's going to be a little bit more governmental control there. Like, what is it like if you said, "Hey, we've got a $350 million fund we want to go in and we want to find Chinese companies to invest in"? Is there more governmental control than there generally is in the U.S.?
There is more governmental control in areas that are sensitive to, the government. So a good example was telecom. So I
Yeah.
chose to set up a venture capital fund that was completely focused on what we called the mobile internet. The funny thing, Jason, just by the way, is that 20 years ago, mobile internet in America was your laptop connected through Wi-Fi to Starbucks. And in China, mobile internet really meant that the only device everyone had was a phone. And you were going to be downloading Java games to your phone. So the issue we ran into, Jason, was the following: was that app developers, content developers, service creators were all private sector people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time when the big telecom providers like China Mobile, China Unicom created these like ecosystems where content developers could commercialize their content. But what we found was that the government over time would ruin that ecosystem by by incrementally controlling it and restricting it. So here's one example. So everybody knows American Idol, and there was a time when in the U.S. that you would vote through SMS on your phone for your favorite singer. Okay.
Yeah.
So in China, the way that worked was that you charged people a premium fee for, voting for their favorite singer. And in my book, there's a story about the Supergirl competition. And honestly, it was so big in China, there was 800 million votes cast in one season. So think about that.
Yeah.
So that went great. The business I was in, we were making millions of dollars of profit on just premium texting. But then what the government decided was this exercise in democracy, which is basically voting for somebody on your phone, is too dangerous. And so in the end, they shut it down. And so that was the end of the opera.
They because they didn't want the people to get used to the fact that they had a democratic way of doing things.
Yes, yeah, because so their worry was that a DJ on a radio station might one day wake up and say, "Let's have a vote on the leadership of the country and whether they're competent or not." So
that's funny.
So they were worried. But let me make one other comment about U.S. and U.S. investors in China. So you are right, that Bloomberg and CNBC now have more and more of this discussion about whether China is investable or not. And I hate to say it, Jason, but I think what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly since COVID, was that the Chinese government had a big regulatory crackdown on a lot of the private sector businesses that really matter, particularly in the internet and in the tech sector. And the bottom line is that Alibaba and Tencent, which were their two big ones, both of those companies were on their way to $1 trillion market caps, similar to Amazon and our big guys here in the US. And following this regulatory crackdown, and following taking Alibaba's CEO Jack Ma into custody for ideological impurities or whatever, today those companies are worth maybe 1/3. of
Yeah.
what they had been worth. And so as a U.S. investor, you look at that and you say, okay, there's a classic case of the central government has basically destroyed an investment opportunity and has
Right.
destroyed value in the market. So I hate to say it, but I mean, I think even at the private investing level, it's harder and harder to find opportunities. And, I guess some people might say, Jason, that the consumer opportunity is a big one. And again, up until COVID, the Chinese people represented 40% of all consumption of luxury goods in the world. So Louis
Wow.
Vuitton,
Yeah.
yeah, all the main stuff. The Chinese were big consumers. And what's happened now with the crackdown on the property sector and the deleveraging of the property developers, you've got this situation that the urban middle class, which it represents, most of the wealth in China, they're losing confidence. And as they've lost confidence, how can you as an investor jump into a consumer business that's focused on them?
Yeah.
Because what you're looking at now is the potential for some fairly serious pullback in domestic consumption in China.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. So now let's start to, I'm not ready to wrap quite yet, but I want to make sure that we cover off on something that I know you're personally passionate about, and that's helping the next generation of talent who wants to do what you've done in your career, do business in China, potentially go to China. I'm curious what, I don't know you to know that you do mentorship, but I would guess based on our conversation, this is something you'll mentor people on. You've written a book about it. Anybody can do it. Well, the book will be in the show notes. I'm curious, like, what do you like? You've got somebody coming out of MIT, and they say, "Hey, I'm thinking China might be the place I want to go." They're you 30 some years ago, like you said. What do you think people need to know now, good, bad, ugly, about potentially taking the same path that you took?
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's kick it off by first being, full disclosure that China is sort of in the penalty box right now.
Yes, it
And
is.
what I mean by that is, who would have thought that the U.S. economy is doing really well right now, and the Chinese economy is sort of being driven into a ditch? And what does that mean for a young person when they're thinking about, do I expose my career to a country which might not be doing so well in the long term? But put that aside and think about the fact that China's here to stay. China
Yeah.
is a world beater in everything from solar panels to lithium-ion batteries to electric vehicles to artificial intelligence. So, China is going to continue to be a leader in all of the key technologies that we care about here in America. And, I think for young people, think about it this way. So I'll tell you a quick story about my last
Yeah.
chapter in my book. So I woke up, I was in my, I was about 50 years old by then. And, I looked around and I thought, okay, the local talent in China is basically squeezing the foreigners out. And, I said
Oh,
to myself,
they're just getting that. They're getting
they're good
good.
and good. Yeah,
They're
yeah, yeah.
good. Yeah.
So,
Getting good.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the local talent in China is very capable.
Mm-hmm.
And, I thought to myself, well, the Swiss do watches, the Americans do airplanes and jet engines pretty well. And so I thought about that and I was like, okay, what can I do in the aerospace industry where I can, still be an active player in the Chinese economy? And I found this air finance course run by Citibank down in Hong Kong. So I enrolled in that. It was about a 3-day course, and they teach you everything about asset financings and residual values and all these different aspects of the credit world. And I looked around when I got down there and I was in my business suit and everyone was like a 25-year-old Hong Kong Chinese and they were all working for, local banks. And I thought, okay, now I really am a fish out of water. But
Yeah.
I ran into a French guy who was about my age and he was basically buying mature Airbus airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
And he would bring investors in and they would jointly own these airplanes. And then what they would do is they would disassemble them and sell the parts. And so, the cash flow from the parts was greater than the purchase price of the airplane.
Sure.
Bingo, you've got a high-end junkyard business. So
Yeah.
I immediately put together a business plan for China to do exactly that. Came here to the US, talked to various investors in this sector in San Francisco and New York. And from that, found a lead to a guy down in Florida who had just signed a joint venture with Air China. So the sort of the punchline of that, Jason, is that for young people, think about the fact that sometimes you might not have the experience or the pedigree to be hired into a certain sector, but a lot of times you can actually make your opportunity yourself.
Mm,
Sometimes you actually start a business in it yourself. Sometimes you go get some training. But one way or another, you can often make, if you see a sector that you want to get into, and employers here in the United States are not interested, figure out how to make an opportunity. And I'll give you a hint. With China, one way to make an opportunity in the current economic situation is Chinese private companies are beginning to realize that in order to grow, they have to get out of China.
yeah.
And one of the things they're doing now is they're coming to Mexico, they're coming to the US. So, in everything, again, from solar panels to batteries to electric vehicles, you're seeing localization in the United States. And one
Yeah.
of the things these Chinese guys are going to need is they're going to need, young US people who are competent and can help bridge them into this market. And if you think about, if you work with a Chinese company to set up a battery factory in America or an electric vehicle business in the United States, you're getting cutting edge technology and you're getting a view into how Chinese run their businesses. And that
Mhm.
makes you incredibly valuable, not just, with other Chinese companies, but with any US employer. I mean, the fact that, this move, it creates US jobs, it creates competitiveness, and it puts young people in America who take that opportunity and puts them in a really good position. If you don't like that opportunity, you still have, remember that Tesla makes more electric cars in China than it makes in the United States.
Sure. Yeah.
And Apple still sources basically everything from China.
Everything. Yeah.
So when you leave San Francisco airport at nighttime to fly to Asia, there are a ton of young people jumping on those planes who are basically working for US tech, who interface all across Asia in interesting jobs.
Yeah. So there's plenty of opportunity, just like I think for anybody. And I'm really, I just realized, I was reading on LinkedIn this morning that the job market is a little cool for recent grads, was the article. I don't know how true. I didn't get into it, but I just noticed that was a headline. So another thing to consider. Mark, I want to wrap by asking you, and I ask all my authors this question: why write a book?
No, it's a great question. So, three things. First is, here I am, I'm 60. My kids always wondered what the heck I was doing in China because I was jumping around all these different companies and industries. And so the first thing was a memoir, a chronicle for my children to really understand what dad did in China. And
Reason,
then
right? Best
yeah,
reason.
yeah. And then the second reason was that my career had this uniqueness from the perspective that, as I said, I jumped from aircraft maintenance to auto parts to mobile technology to venture capital to asset trading, and I feel that the scope of that gives any reader a very good view of what was going on in China, and particularly this transition from the dominant state to a very vibrant, private sector in China. And then the last reason is that in the 30 years that I was in China, China basically, when I got there in the 80s, turned away from ideology and class struggle and, craziness, and turned away from central planning and basically implemented very practical market oriented reforms. And in the course of those 30 years, 800 people were lifted out of poverty. So, one could
800
argue
million people. 800
800
million
million,
people.
I'm
800
sorry,
million.
800
Wow.
million people were lifted out of poverty.
Wow.
So one could argue that that has been so far the most important event of our lifetime.
Absolutely. That is a staggering number of people. For almost,
I mean,
2.5 times the population of the U.S. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. So China today has people who have a reasonable level of control over their lives. They have aspirations. They went from nothing, no ownership of their homes, no ownership of a business, no car, no nothing. A bicycle and a radio was something that people really pined after. And, today China is a country where the local people basically can make decisions about where they want to work and how they want to live their lives. And it's a huge change or improvement in people's well-being over such a short period of time.
Yeah, that is a tremendous change in not that many years in the grand scheme of history, is it?
Yeah,
it really isn't. Excellent, Mark. Well, let's wrap up. And like, what's next for you? You said you've got the kids. You said you're 60. You've written a book. What's next for you? And what are you like? What's next on your horizon?
Yeah, so look, I continue to engage with China. I enjoy looking at the daily news feed out of China. So I've got three things going on related to China. One is I consult with a software company based out of Dallas, Texas, that is owned by the world's major airlines. And what we do is we help airlines to basically connect their management systems to their supplier networks. So American's a big user, Delta's a big user, United's a user. And so I get airlines in China like Air China, China Eastern also connected. So it's like helping the Chinese, airlines with their supply chain. The second thing I do is I work with a Chinese company that is interested in developing what's called a flying test bed. So think about when you design a new aircraft engine, you need to have something like a 747 to carry your engine up to flight test altitudes and speeds. So I work with those guys. There's a company in Seattle that would help to modify the airplane, and I help the Chinese to basically scour the world for old 747s and help them buy it. And then my last thing is that pre-COVID, the Chinese were sending lots of young Chinese kids to America to learn how to fly. Because we have open skies and we have lots of small flight schools, very inexpensive to learn how to become a commercial aircraft pilot.
Yeah.
So I help to bridge Chinese students into small privately held flight schools here in the U.S.
Very cool. That was unexpected and very cool. That's really interesting. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for your time and your energy today. Appreciate the work you're doing. One of the things I've been thinking about during this interview is that it's very likely that something that you've done, I've experienced based on the work you've done over the last 30 years. Either the products I've used, the aircraft I've flown in, it's extremely likely that you probably we have a closer connection than I would ever know, just based on all the things that you've worked on over the years. So I just want to thank you for that. Thank you for writing the book. And I always like to ask my guests, are there any last words you'd like to impart onto everybody listening?
Yeah. So look, again, I think in general, people, don't be afraid, take risks, reinvent yourself, make your opportunity. And Jason, thank you so much for inviting me onto your show.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. It was a pleasure to have you. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks. You very much. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking to Cool People with Jason Frizzell. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook and give us a shout out or take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. If something from today's episode piqued your interest and you'd like to connect, email us at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com. We love hearing from our listeners because you're cool people too.